Hi guy, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. As always, I'm your weekly host Lorfarius, and for this week I have gone and picked Fast Food Dizzy. Now, Dizzy fans, don't be getting upset with that name. I will explain my reasons behind calling it later on. Before we start that journey though, we need to have a look into this week's Amiga news. Now, first up, some really good news for the show. Matt Teddy was chatting to me over on Facebook the other day and said that he has been a regular listener to the show right from the start, and he's been doing this over on his travels in the Australian outback. He even snapped a picture showing where he'd been, so thanks Matt, it did amaze me no end. We only have a small listenership over in Australia, and it's good to know that one of them actually got in touch. I'm starting to think that there's nowhere AMIGArama can't reach. I should have asked him to get a picture with the podcast logo on his phone. We could have showed that off as a screenshot. The next bit of news might only be for Amiga coding fans, but I did manage to come across a great web resource just the other day. Now, this is a site called the Amiga Source Preservation, and it's been gathering all sorts of source code and scans of like official Amiga books for, well, the original systems. There's even some games and workbench applications mixed in there, and it's a proper one-size-fits-all for that coding scene. The years are moving on, and it's only a matter of time before this stuff disappears entirely. So I'm all for fan sites coming along and keeping it safe for future generations. I doubt any of this is legal, but Commodore is long since gone, and if they don't do it, no one else will. Besides, there's always a chance someone else can come along and maybe make some newer Amiga gear off the back of this code, especially with everything they have on there. If it's of use, let us know, as I'd love to read out what my listeners think of them doing stuff about this. Even if you disagree or think it's a really bad thing to do, just get in touch and we'll read out the best stuff on the show. Next up, and I know this is a bit late as always, but I have been following the Antstream site on and off now for several months. They've just launched their retro gaming service with, I believe, hundreds of Amiga games on it. It might even be a couple of thousand. As a concept, I really like the idea. It's a mix of iTunes with on-the-tap gaming, but the biggest hurdle for it has to be the lag. Usually I'd be all for giving them the benefit of the doubt, but from what I've been seeing over on YouTube, a lot of this is videos in action, and I could see that they haven't really beaten the lag monster. Audio was skipping from what I saw during very frantic moments, and that was on a 100 meg fibre connection. It might be a neat idea, but it really seems like they still have a lot of bugs to iron out. But at least I'm confident that given enough time, it should get a lot better as a service. I'm not sure what you guys think of this as an idea or even as a useful thing in total. Hardware at this point, it's a good 25-30 years in some cases. It's very time limited of how long it's actually going to last, and it's probably going to start failing well within our lifetime, so we probably will have to switch over to other solutions at some point. Antstream seems to be off to a good start with loads of games, and I do think that they need to sort out that core service. But as a concept and original idea, it really seems to work. I'm sort of looking forward to which way it might go. Would any of you lot use this? Is anybody signed up to its subscription at the moment? There'll be a link in the show notes as usual, but I think it's around about $7.99 a month. It might be $9.99. God, I didn't write that bit down. It's not too expensive, and it did remind me a bit of Netflix and that sort of streaming service. It seems to be fairly priced at least. And that's about all I have for Amiga news this week. Yeah, sadly it's a bit short coming. So with that out of the way, it's finally time to tackle Fast Food Dizzy. I've always been very fond of the egg games. It's been some time since we covered the last, but when I had the chance to cover something that wasn't simply yet another platform game, I've jumped at the chance. It's not one I got to play when I was growing up, and for years I'll have to admit that I had the view it was just a run-of-the-mill Pac-Man clone, so approaching it for today's show I'm hoping to be proven wrong. Now, not a lot of 8 to 16-bit conversions made the Switch so well. I mean, just look at Head Over Heels as an example. But if anyone can do it and do it well, it's got to be the Dizzy series. He had so many different spin-offs during the 8 and 16-bit eras that I'm not even sure how many are actually tucked away on the system. There always seems to be some new Dizzy game popping up on Kickstarter, and a lot of those are often stuff that's been stashed in the Oliver Twins loft for decades. Now, this was published by Codemasters, who did all of the Dizzy games, Grand Prix, MiG-29, Soviet Fighter, a massive list. They were huge. Eventually they switched over to consoles, but for a good while it was Amiga all the way. This one wasn't in turn developed by the Oliver Twins, but by a company called Optimus. Now, they did Big Nose, Fantasy World Dizzy, that's the one we covered, Mean Machine, all of the Seymour games, and that's definitely a series I want to cover at some point. This came out in 1990 and it was on just one floppy disk. Single player game despite being similar to Pac-Man, and it was priced at £6.99, so budget all the way. The coder for this was Neil Hill. He worked on Big Nose, Pegasus, all the Seymour games that came out. Graphics wise, Adrian Ludley, he did Butcher Hill, Mean Machine, Pegasus again. I'm not even sure, that must be a shooter. It sounds a shootery. Music was Alistair Brimble. He did all the Team 17 stuff, awesome artist. Indie Heat, one of my all-time favourite games, and most of Codemasters' catalogue. It's no secret that when the Oliver Twins were finding most of their coding fame for Codemasters, especially during the 1980s, the majority of their games were created on an Amstrad, and then thanks to some technical trickery, they made a device which was able to port games between the Amstrad and the ZX Spectrum. A lot of this was down to similarities between the two computers, and though I don't know anything about how it all worked, I'm not the coding type, but this did offer them all sorts of opportunities to easily port stuff across. Now, this meant that they were able to focus on one higher spec version, then effectively bring a reduced one across in what was probably a record time. This meant that they must have been darlings to the darlings at Codemasters. God, I'm sorry for that one, guys. During some downtime over a weekend whilst working on Grand Prix Simulator 2, the two brothers began knocking back and forth a couple of ideas, wondering if there was a good Pac-Man game out for the Spectrum, and after much to-ing and fro-ing, they realised it hadn't really been done yet, at least to any real success. Whereas Pac-Man focused on pellets, they wanted to go for a less healthy option and opted to use junk food instead. Then they quickly built mazes up around fast food. At this stage, Dizzy wasn't even in the mix, and the pair were able to ask David Whittaker if he could come up with some suitable music. This was all happening over the same weekend, by the way. I'm sure they had an emphasis for it not to sound too much like Pac-Man, at least to ward off any legal worries, I'm sure. It wasn't long before the game was finished, and fresh-faced on a Monday morning, they presented the results to Codemasters. The game's theme of food also gave marketeer Bruce Everest an idea to try and come up with a pitch for the Happy Eater restaurant chain. They seemed interested at first, but after a couple of weeks their interest waned, and it seems that they pulled out to leave the Oliver Twins to have to come up with an alternative idea. The Dizzy series was doing extremely well, and it just seemed like a good suggestion to merge the two properties together. And after having one of the series coders, Neil Adamson, make changes to all the graphics, the game was complete. This was where it all gets a bit strange, as Codemasters decided to drop Dizzy from the title, as if it was going to be its own game, but they decided to leave all of the art and pictures of him in. The excuse seems to be because they thought that people people would see Dizzy on the cover and then just link the two together, but even the Oliver twins thought that Fast Food Dizzy sounded a better title than plain old fast food. That's the same reason why I'm going to call it that throughout the entire show. They liked it, so it's going to stick, and I'm going to stick it on top of the show title as well. Sales were good enough that a later 16-bit version just made sense. Most of the core gameplay was brought across, but Codemasters decided to completely rework the maze design, mainly try to improve it for the 16-bit market. I did try to contact the Oliver brothers over on Twitter, but I'm sorry to say I didn't hear anything back. I suspect they probably don't know, as it was a much later port than what they'd worked on originally. When it came to the Amiga release, after a few years on shelves, Amiga Action held a competition for readers with an updated version of it called Dizzy's Easter Extravaganza. This was shortened to just a few levels and upon completion would offer a code for entry into a prize draw. Although I've no idea who won, and even if that person is listening today, if you are, get in touch. I'd be interested to know what you actually won and if it ever turned up. There were only ever a few ports of this, one for the CPC 464, Atari STE, Commodore 64, of course the PC or the DOS version, and the good old ZX Spectrum. Even though our Eggtacular hero is involved in this week's game, there isn't any sort of story to mention. The well is dry, so to speak, and from what I could see, there wasn't even a bit of a blurb over on the back of the box, so we've got nothing to help set the scene. I know from what I found out about the game's history that Dizzy was sort of glued in at the last minute, but I would have at least hoped for a tiny bit of something fun. So let's just pretend he's out to conquer the world and take on the mighty McDonald's, at least before next week's show rolls around. With a plotless, heavy heart, we are going to have to move on to the game itself. A few black lines along the bottom of the screen show off your lives, the number of the current maze, and the score is off to the side. There isn't much to tell, and what is there doesn't clutter the screen at all. Seeing the sights on the first level should be familiar to UK listeners, as there's nothing but a few bushes and random stone statues to help kick off the mood. Dizzy runs about as his usual eggy self, animated to a higher degree than I think I've seen in some of his previous games. Junk food is literally running throughout the small, compact mazes, and it's your task to catch and collect each of them to help finish the stage. The more you munch, the more points you will score. Several condiments can appear on the tracks as well. These range from magic boots that give you the double speed boost, and they're always handy to outrun the other monsters on screen. Relish to slow down the enemies, mustard is used to freeze them, and it's shocking stuff if you've never had it before, so no wonder it stops them clearing the tracks. Finally, to round off all the junk food items, there's a nice red bottle of ketchup which will help you clear out all the monsters on screen. The Olivers must have run out of condiments at this point, because the shields, invisibility and speed items for the game collectibles are all just simple icons. Something like an empty burger box could have easily made the ideal shield, to say the least, or a half-eaten doner kebab. You're more likely to find one of those out on the streets in the UK rather than a wild flaming burger. Usually about now I'd be waxing lyrical about the controls and trying my best to go into detail, but Fast Food Dizzy takes that classic Pac-Man formula and only has the directions. No fire, no diagonals or even fancy moves. If you run into a wall, then Dizzy stops, but for the most part, if you push in any direction, he just runs and keeps on running. There's a bit of momentum if you push the opposite way, but it flows well enough that you always feel like you have some control. Don't be worrying though, it's not constant running and you will stop if you manage to hit a wall. Bumping into the enemies is often a case of you not being quick enough to react, and it does a good enough job of trying to copy what Pac-Man did over in the arcades. There was a moment where it felt to me more like he was just taking a brisk stroll through the park, That is of course unless you bump into any of the speed power-ups. Those are game changers because it really goes off the charts. For listeners worrying about difficulty, there's 3 modes of play in here, with the park being the easiest setting, followed by the toy town, and then the supermarket, each representing easy, normal and a hard mode. There's also a random pick mode just to make it a bit more interesting. The higher you go in the stage settings, the less lives Dizzy has, so it can be tough to get far at first unless you put in plenty of practice. It retains that older 8-bit feel, so you will be right at home if you've had your hands on this before. A game like this rides high on its mazes, and there's a selection here that will make most eyes water. Things like race tracks with F1 cars, medieval classes, trains crossing the levels, Egyptian tombs, snooker tables, Subbuteo football fields, the list just goes on and on. At times, these stages are flipped and you will probably need to take a moment to adjust as everything runs around upside down. The colours on show are off to the Amiga's usual high standard, with a high cartoony look that goes above and beyond what Pac-Man ever could. There are parts where the stages break away from the 4 directions and it allows you to move diagonally to a degree. It can be a bit awkward to do, and it can make a nice change at least to the usual trapped environment. These are all single screen mazes though, so it never ventures beyond what you can see on the screen. One of the nicest things about Fast Food Dizzy is the music. To say it's a budget release, they filled every single section with it. Most are quick, pumping melodies that help keep you on your toes, but a few places like the puzzle rooms and park grounds do share the same tunes for matching the themes on show. If it annoys you, then I'm afraid that the only way to get rid of it is by muting your old TV. There's no button to turn any of it off, and even if you could, there's no sign of any sound effects, so there's nothing to worry about there. It's that time of the show where we need to look at some of the game's problems. First up, without a fire button, there isn't much to complain about, but with all the items to collect, I would still have preferred the chance to fling something at the enemies or even jump over them. Think something like, is it Pac-Man 3D or Pac-Mania? I'm thinking of the Master System game there. Dizzy has always had that famous air spin, so it could have easily been worked into this and would have worked wonders. Yes, I understand it was never meant to be that way, but when it came out on the Amiga, it could have just been so much better. They could have easily chucked that in without a problem. The sad lack of sound effects means that you collect items and then just run away in silence from the enemies. There's not even a scream or a growl from any of the monsters. Half the time I'm playing, I kept imagining simple pings or ringing out when I grasped the food. They've skimped on it completely and it counts against it as a whole. Sometimes, from what I noticed, the collision detection can seem a bit strict, with the fast-paced monsters easily catching up to you when they close in on you around corners. I was convinced it dropped a bit of speed when you ran around them, so it's not often possible to escape, and once one of them closes in on your tail, you're going to lose a life. It can feel a tad unfair on longer straights just because of that. Lastly, I'm not sure if this even counts as a problem, but when I played the upside down stages, I thought my Amiga was actually broken. That flip screen did make me feel a bit silly for sure, but I have to hold something against it, and that has to be it. When it came to the magazine scores, there was only one review for CU Amiga who gave it an above average 82%, which isn't bad, I suppose. If you're wondering why I'm covering this at all I can say is that I'm not quite sure myself. I was trying to pick a random game for an episode when I fired this up just to have a quick go. Before I knew what was happening, I'd managed to lose half an hour to it, which is always a good sign. I'm not sure why the magazines never gave it the time of day, but for once I'm glad I've picked up on something that they've managed to miss. Not being an all-singing and dancing epic isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it doesn't mean it won't be covered on the show. For Pac-Man fans wanting a game with a bit more meat on its bones, Fast Food Dizzy might just be the game for you. It doesn't do much to put it far above the yellow pill popper, but at the very least it just shows how capable the Oliver twins were with doing decent clones of arcade classics and going beyond the basics for a Maze Runner. The vibrant colours and very English scenery give it all a fun feel that makes you want to keep on playing. There's so many different screen designs to see, and I'll admit to being a bit put out that the 8-bit levels weren't included, yet they've done an amazing job with the bigger sections like the snooker table. Running around the balls and the enemies about on there was absolutely amazing, and it was a good representation of what you'd expect that to be. The flurry of comedy skits between stages pinches that ghost chase scene from the good old Pac-Man arcade, but the difference this time is that they added actual scenery and jokes to see. Seeing Dizzy hit by a shrink ray, then walk off as a tiny dot with the line, "I need a shrink," added a lot of fun to it and a tiny bit of humour that I really appreciated. Some of the maze designs are extremely challenging, and it's going to take you weeks to get through these. I know it's going to struggle for me for sure. For the price at launch, it feels like there's more value here than, say, a public domain game, and I think they've done a great job making a quirky, fun arcade title. They certainly achieve what they set out to do. Of late, I've been more and more annoyed at the lack of, say, music on Amiga games. With all the stuff it's capable of as a system, to see games drop it on a regular basis just to say publisher time limits or silly technical limitations, it's always disappointing. Yet, this has an explosion of sound for music on every section. The speed and pacing matches the game perfectly, and I couldn't help but be impressed by Alistair Brimble's efforts. The missing sound effects are a real shame. A few here and there could have helped lift this above many Maze clones and almost make it the perfect game to play in the arcades. It's so close to being an amazing little budget title, but it just doesn't quite go all the way. The most important question I have to ask, is this a worthy entry in the Dizzy franchise? Our eggy friend by this point was starting to have many more appearances than, say, Super Mario could ever have dreamed of. By no means is this gonna blow your socks off, but it has a lot more going for it and it definitely deserves its place in the franchise. There's enough going on with Fast Food Dizzy that it improves on the classic 8-bit versions no end. Remember how limited Head Over Heels seemed? This has none of those issues, and it's a brilliant way to remaster an 8-bit game and bring it over to the 16-bit systems. This throws in just enough extra fries to fill you. It's a meal better than you could possibly expect. Unlike a McDonald's, I think this one's definitely worth a closer look. Well, sadly, that's about it for this week's show. As we draw things to a close, if you want to drop me a comment or some sort of email, you can do so over on Lorfarius@AMIGArama.com. Come along to the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/AMIGArama. I'm always posting lots of pictures and videos and getting involved in discussions on there, so I think it's worthwhile popping along. You can also follow me on Twitter, which is @AmigaRamaPod. I do need to take a moment to thank everyone that offers support for the show or contributes in any way, shape or form. A lot of people like to get involved on patreon.com, which is /AmigaRama. If you'd like to do so, pop along there yourself and see if you can help out. This week, a massive thank you goes out to our Patreon supporters. They are 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast, Adam Bradley, Darren Coles, Gary Heather, Graham Vebke, Glenn Milford from Casual Retro Gamer Weekly, Jan Holbo Rasmussen, Jason Warnes, Lawrence Giraud, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, Pistol, Bremsky, Quentin Barnes, Retro Ravi, Richard Legg, Richard Pearson, Sneff, Steve Engeldo, and Treble. Thanks for listening, and until next time, guys.